his kind of major contribution to this space in many ways is that he's the guy who came up with the term disruptive innovation. And I'm going to talk through today just a couple of the ways that he sees that as humans we respond particularly to disruption and largely to innovation. And so, I don't know, pretty much all of us have seen these or played with these. And I've got a daughter who is in her final year of her BA and wants to be a game designer. And when I first brought a headset home for us to play with, because we're a gaming family, in fact, she took my PlayStation to university with her. So when we started playing with it, I said, well, what do you reckon? And she said, well, it's more immersive, but you really look stupider. And I thought, yeah, this is kind of why we need more women in product design, right? And then I started thinking, what's the history of the VR headset? And I know some of you may have heard me talk about some of this before, but does anyone know when it was patented? Yeah? About 1990. Anybody else want to have another guess? I'm going to give you a hint. I'm 55 years old, and it was before I was born. Yeah, well, then we had the Viewmaster, but the actual VR headsets were patented late 50s, early 60s. They were developed, and the first ones were so heavy they had to be suspended from the ceiling. Okay, and then you put your head up inside it, and they were VR headsets. And so I find it really interesting because what often happens with technology, and I don't care whether we're now talking about blockchain or we're talking about big data or we're talking about AI or any of these things have very long gestation periods before they become popular. So I'm going to talk a wee bit about big data. I started doing big data in 1986 on a mainframe. And in those days, in order to do what I can now do pretty much on my phone, I used to have to code, and I would run that code. It would take me 12 hours to run the code in order to pass quite a large data set. And if I got any of those lines of code wrong, it would spit it out, and I literally had to wait until 10 o'clock the next evening to run the code again, because there had to be a minimum of traffic on the copper wire in order for me to hold the line for the 12 hours to run the code, right? And I know this is like, some of you will be going, oh God, are we going to get old fart technology stories about the old days when I lived in a cardboard box? And I promise you it's not that. But what I want you to think about is that we often fall in love with the technology, and the technology is not the thing that will make the difference at all. What's interesting now about why VR or AI or big data or blockchain or any of these things are having a moment is that the business models that enable them are now becoming possible. So if we think about what is the difference between us having kit in our home that we play with versus that kind of early 1960s headsets, is a bunch of stuff that is often infrastructure. So we have broadband-ish into our home. It's still slower than I can get on a mobile phone in the channel for $40 a month, all you could eat in the UK. Does that make sense? So what we call broadband, or what we even call ultra-fast, is kind of what the rest of the world calls slow these days. The Isle of Jersey, almost 7 years ago, had a gig a second to every home and every business, and is now moving to a point where they're going to have 100 gigs a second to every business and every home. So those kinds of technologies becoming ubiquitous and cheap, which they're still not in New Zealand, but we need to understand in Europe these technologies for like broadband, real broadband, are incredibly cheap. And so that means something like this is much easier to deliver to me because it can come through my PlayStation, through my broadband, into our spare room. And it's those changes that mean that someone like PlayStation can have a look and figure out a business model for virtual reality that makes sense. I first saw a presentation on the use of virtual reality in the agricultural sector in Singapore in 1997. And it was going to be the next big thing in ag. But what they hadn't thought about was, while that tech could work, there was no business model that would make it work. There was no demand from customers, and there really was no simplicity that there was a way to monetize it. And so often when we develop new science or technology, we forget about the monetization till the end, and we become what I call a solution looking for a market. And the things that are much easier to commercialise are the ones that have a customer pull through. So the lesson from Clayton Christensen in looking at this slide is that when we see new things, the first thing that a human does is what I'm going to call point and laugh. We go, oh my God, that's stupid, right? So my daughter will go, more immersive, but looks stupider. And I can remember, many technologies like that where I've thought about them and just gone, yeah, but what's the point? And so if you take nothing else from my talk today, I want you to take the 3 things that people do when faced with disruption. And the first one I'm going to call point and laugh. So I did exactly that, even after having all of this training, when I first came across cultured meat. And so this is a business that Fonterra has invested in. It uses basically a calf blood-based substrate and cultures meat cells. It gets nicknamed in the press pink slime, various other kinds of terms. As soon as you hear those sort of attempts to be derogatory to something, you know point and laugh is at play. And I remember saying exactly this at a dairy conference 5 years ago when I first stumbled across this. And I said, there's no way I'm feeding this to my family. Now, the truth is I'm probably still not going to feed it to my family. But what is interesting about it is that the possibility of feeding it to my family has become much closer in that time. And the ick factor over time disappears quite a lot as we start to see other things come into play. This is my Impossible Burger that I ate in 2016 up at Stanford University. And it was bloody delicious, okay? Just want to get that out there. Both bloody and delicious. And what was interesting to me about it was that I was with a vegan friend who refused to eat it because the smell was so convincing she didn't believe it didn't have meat in it. And that burger has only got better over time. There were a number of agricultural leaders at the time, including our then Minister of Agriculture, who refused to eat it, and largely because they thought that there was some sort of disloyalty to our meat industry if you put one of these in your mouth. Which to me, again, is just a version of point and laugh. It's kind of belittling the opposition in order to kind of make them seem like they don't really matter. And I just want you to catch yourself if you do that around any of these technologies. What is fascinating to me about the Impossible Burger is that what it's done is that it's got a brand new business model. So at Beef and Lamb, I think there was something like 12 steps, between the producer and the consumer when we looked at value chain mapping. Impossible Burger buys their inputs from farms that they're increasingly investing in, travels them to a factory, one person in between. They then take those, process them, and they have their own distribution into food service and supermarkets. So when they get the price of this down, the value that is returned to the processor is enormous in comparison to the way that our meat industry works. That, to me, is the scary bit. Not that, oh my God, the world's going to turn vegan. And so I think it's really important that we understand that their business model is advancing at a much greater rate than it is in our New Zealand meat sector. So this is US milk consumption. It's continued to decline, particularly for what they call white milk. There are blips of increase in milk. As you'll know, world milk production is year on year a record. So as our large markets are declining in their demand, our ability to produce volume milk is increasing at a more than inverse rate to the decline. So it doesn't take very long for us to figure out that milk is not the future, despite what we might kind of look at. And I want you to hold that, because what the milk industry has done is the second one of these responses. So the first response was point and laugh. The second one I'm going to call regulate or sue. So what happens is when the point and laugh is pointless, which it always is, what they do then is they say, you know what, we're going to regulate so that you can't call almond milk milk. Milk can only, under US definition now, be a mammary secretion from an ovine or bovine animal. I know, exactly what I want on my cornflakes. Right? And you can see the pointlessness of this. Right? I went back and I found, I was arguing with some Christians, which didn't help, but the Bible has multiple references to almonds. And when I went back further into the Aramaic, because I'm a nerd, almond milk has been in use as a term for almost 1,000 years. And Christians used to avoid milk at Lent. And in the English tradition, since at least 600, the year 600 AD, almond milk was the preferred milk to be used in Lent. And so we have long cultural traditions of non-dairy milks. And so for us to kind of go, okay, I know how we're going to stop the vegans now, pointing and laughing at them didn't work, so you know what, we'll sue the bastards. How dare they, yeah? And so, you know, this is happening, it's the same, they're protesting the definitions of meat, you know, does meat have to come from a dead animal? All of these debates are not customer focused. They're all designed to make an aging industry or an industry that's under threat feel better about themselves. And I think it's quite important that we don't waste momentum doing this. The third thing, so when the pointing and laughing and the suing doesn't work, and it universally doesn't work, the third thing we do is two options. We either buy up the competition or we flee the space. And so what's happened here is that the two largest investors in non-dairy milk in the world are Danone, who are one of the largest top 3 milk producers in the world. Danone, and the number 2 now is Coca-Cola. So they're thinking very clearly about where their future markets are. And this pattern, point and laugh, regulate or sue, flee or buy, is what plays out over and over and over again. And my suggestion is we just bypass that lot and go straight to figuring out what to do next. So here, these are the biggest meat producers in the US, who also happen to be the biggest investors in plant-based meat. So if we're going to bypass sort of the old stuff and think about the future, then I believe we should jump straight to business models of the future. And the things that really make business models of the future work are a couple of things. And one of them I talked about a bit with Impossible Foods is this idea of what's called disintermediation. So the number of steps between the producer and the consumer is really short these days thanks to the internet. So if we think again about what changed with the headset, we had internet, we had ability to have technology in the home, we had business models through PlayStation that meant they could deliver me a service that I wanted. So the same is happening. And the new competitors in our space, so things like vegan food, are moving to those business models from day one. So they're born digital. They're not worrying about having to change their businesses from an old business to a new business, but the new ones who are doing very well, and I would include Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger in there, is they're thinking digital business models from day one. And so I don't know if any of you follow Beyonce. She gets $700,000 US a post, which I think is a very interesting business model. And in 2018, she joined up with an organisation called Greenprint and did the 22-day vegan challenge, which has probably been the biggest influencer on American purchasing of vegan food. I want you to hear I talk about vegan food, not people becoming vegans. So the evidence is that the number of vegans is not particularly increasing. However, in the UK alone, in the last 2 years, there has been a 400% increase in the sale of vegan food. Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's, Waitrose, they all now have vegan food lines, and most of them cannot keep up with demand. I want you to hear these are not vegans buying this food. These are omnivores who are reducing their meat intake. And so often what happens is, again, in the meat industry, we point and laugh by saying, well, yeah, they're not really vegans, they sneak on a bit of bacon. Well, actually, they don't see themselves as vegans. They see themselves as reducing their impact on the planet, or they see themselves as eating healthier. And one of the ways they see themselves doing that is what's called this flexitarian diet, and it's probably like many of you eat now, and it is the way that particularly young people in New Zealand eat, where they might have meat as a treat, or they might have it 2 or 3 nights a week, and the rest of the week they eat vegetable-based food. And so that trend is probably one of the biggest trends we need to be thinking about, and thinking about how we capitalise on that. So these guys were born digital, 22-day nutrition. Then I want you to, I know there's been some discussion around regenerative agriculture and what that might mean. And I'm going to kind of plant myself down and say we've had a lot of debates within the sector about whether it's regenerative or whether it's restorative or what it is. But don't ignore what your customer is saying. So we've got customers here saying they want less meat in their diet. Well, in that case, the way to play for the meat industry is to say, eat less meat, but eat the world's best meat. Make that meat phenomenal, right? I came home last night with a ridiculously gorgeous T-bone for my husband and his mate, and I spent $25 on it, and it was worth every cent. And so, for two people, I'm willing to do that because we don't eat meat every night. And I know that farm, I know their farming practices, I'm willing to spend extra for their restorative approach for the flavour of that meat. And that's where we need to be thinking about changing the business model. So we're not thinking about ores, we're not thinking about it's going to cost us more and we're going to get less for it. The evidence is that we can move up the value chain by farming in another way. And actually a lot of the way that we're talking about farming is the way that most New Zealanders farm. They just don't think to tell anyone that they're doing it that way. And so when we look particularly at the sheep sector, the latest IPCC report is very clear about New Zealand lamb being the most sustainable lamb in the world. We should be using that in our marketing, and we're not. So while I said that milk consumption was down and milk production was up, that's very true, but largely it's because also the milk sector worldwide has found ways of moving up the value chain. And so we're at record levels in that same market in the US where milk consumption was falling off a page. They are at record consumption levels for cheese. Yogurt has had its day. It's been rising, and it's now starting to fall, and we're seeing the plant-based yogurts take over. Well, not take over, but growing into that space. But in New Zealand, the maintenance of milk has been down to one thing, which I'm going to credit Wellington with, which is the introduction of great coffee. I'm serious. So latte drinking has driven adult consumption of milk in New Zealand and is the only thing really holding up that market. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing for us to think about, and it has now becoming a global phenomenon. So we were kind of first in that. So the Frappuccinos and the Starbucks, no matter what you might think of their coffee, they are holding up world milk supply or milk consumption into the first world. A lot of New Zealand companies are really thinking about diversification, and the bottom one here is Silver Fern Farms doing premium meat. Up the top is a picture from an Ansco product, which is beef pericardium. So this used to go to pet food, and when I was a young person working in the meat industry, all of this used to go to pet food, and you were lucky if you got cents in the kilo for it. It's now triple milled and washed thanks to some extraordinary research, and it's used to patch carotid arteries and to patch human hearts. And so that reaches, I believe, several thousand a kilo. So those are some of the ways we need to be thinking about moving up the value chain. On the right, some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but I'm deeply shallow and plan on not ageing as fast as I might kind of otherwise. And so one of the ways to do that is that I've been taking various supplements. I realised when I was at the supermarket that this is actually probably almost similar to Davis gelatin for $1.59 in a box. But I paid 59 New Zealand dollars for it, and if they'd said grass-fed organic, I would have paid another 20. So don't underestimate what we can do with good branding. The same with this. My grandmother used to call this stock. We now call it beef bone broth for immune and joint health, and it's powdered stock. Again, I can't find a New Zealand one that is grass-fed organic, and so in our family we bought the Australian one because we knew that it was that. These guys I love who are down in the South Island, wild lamb, they've chosen a very different business model, and what they're doing is that they run their sheep all over their property, they look after themselves most of the year, they eat a phenomenal combination of herbs and grasses, and then they're shot to order during the main lamb consumption seasons. We do taste-offs with chefs at our home, and this one, every single time, is the lamb that everyone chooses as their favourite flavour. So just going to briefly, because I'm going to run out of time, two last things. So one is that I've talked about disintermediation. The other thing I'm going to say is that the future of business is subscription business models for the foreseeable future. If you are not currently running a subscription business model, you are in the past. And the predictions are that within the next 3 years, almost 80% of successful, profitable businesses will have moved to a subscription model. So this is a farm that does subscription meat boxes. This is some local cheese people who are doing cheese. This is avocados as a service out of the Hawke's Bay. This is a fridge that turns your purchases into a subscription service. It's a Samsung Amazon fridge. Every time you take something out of it, it drops a copy of that into your Amazon outbox, and therefore you've now got, butter as a service. This has got to be a Flemish fridge because nobody else eats artichokes and beer. I know. Went and saw these guys a couple of weeks ago. Kimberly was with me. This is a vertical farm in San Francisco that should absolutely scare the crap out of most New Zealand vegetable producers. They get 40 seasons a year out of their vegetable crops. They're doing incredible work with genetics and their ability to get the nutrition to the plants, and with solar power on the roof, they can get their input costs down to almost zero. The nicest tasting rocket I have ever eaten. This is an amazing American company doing work on carbon sequestration. Dunedin company selling monitors for agriculture. And the very last thing I want to leave you with is that American consumers, which are still some of the most wealthy and most consuming humans in the planet, as you'll know from their size, are utterly distrustful of the food system. And they do not believe that they can trust what comes in their mouths, and they trust American food less than foreign food. And this is a huge opportunity for us. When we think about trust and transparency, this is the business model right here. People will pay more to feed their kids something safe. A couple of people doing great things. I would say that Synlait, we're looking at maybe $6.70 out of Fonterra this year, $7 out of Synlait. They've gone for a higher value market. This is a different business model. And then finally, the IPCC report I mentioned around agriculture and around our sheep and beef systems. And the last thing I want to leave you with is New Zealand has a real opportunity to take a stand on food that heals the land, the water, the people, and all living things. And if we want a value proposition that absolutely resonates with today's global discerning consumer, this is the message. And this is where we need to be lining up to make sure that our science supports our farmers so that we can make these claims out in the world and so that we can do it with integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Melissa, for that great tour. And we've got and a great vision at the end of that too. We're starting to get a couple of questions in. Apparently, one got one vote. So here we go. So let's go with that one. I heard you mention the importance of collaboration and diversity in a talk last year. Has this grown or decreased in importance?
Great. That's a great question. So the other thing, I mentioned that subscription business models are the next big thing. There's a whole lot of other work that's been done really interestingly, again, out of Harvard, looking at 5 kinds of strategy that companies around the world do, and they've looked at 35,000 companies. And the emerging form of strategy in our era, so the old strategy is kind of classical, right? Be big, FMCG, dominate your market. What they're finding that's emerging along with these subscription and digital models is what's called platform models. So these are models where you don't have to see the future and you don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but what you do is you create the sandpit for other people to play in, and you enable them to succeed, and you find the smartest people in the world to collaborate with, and then you support them into the marketplace. And so this is kind of a Google model. This is actually a Facebook model. This is the model of any app store. So they're not creating the content. What they're doing is they're creating the platform upon which that will occur. And the only way that that can be successful is through collaboration. So if we think about that another way, you might look at someone like Assure Quality, or you might look at some of the science CRIs, or Lincoln University, other people in the primary sector who could really kind of get up and under and support the industry to be successful in the market. So we could think about transparency systems. So there's no point in just building a transparency system. What if that transparency system also hooked into my rural cash manager, which we know is the accounting system most farmers use in New Zealand, or it might go into Figured, which is their competitor, but it should be an open API. Or what it might do is link very clearly into some of the track and trace possibilities that someone like Kotahi is doing. We've been working on slapping traces onto containers going into Europe. So there's a bunch of those things where the more we can create open systems and the more we can think about how could I make someone else successful, we're seeing that those are the business models that are emerging today that are beating those classical business models hands down, kind of, the old red ocean strategy stuff, beating them every time. It's a really great question.
We're going for the top question there. You say that our lamb is the most sustainable in the world. Saying that deflects us from the reality of our poor practices. What are beef and lamb doing to empower farmers to address this?
I struggle to know what those poor practices are, and I wouldn't have said that probably 3 years ago. So in terms of the lamb sector, I guess you've got the issue of happy, dead. So there's the ethics of having a dead animal as the product. I know, but the other side of that is that we do know that the methane output of lamb is lower than the other animals that we're farming. New Zealand has reduced the number of animals by pretty much a half at the same time as doubling the profit comes off them. This is a very important thing because what we now understand is that feed in equals methane out. And I think at the beginning we just assumed it was the number of animals. And so what we can see is that actually the amount of feed that has gone into our sheep sector has reduced as we've become more efficient at producing lamb. And as an organisation, Beef and Lamb, we are committed to reducing methane at a gross level. So we've got a target of 10% gross. So we're saying without offsetting, we want to reduce by another 10%. We put out a paper long before the zero carbon bill committing to zero carbon for the meat sector, and we're continuing to implement that. So for lamb, I actually really struggle to know where those negative impacts are. I think in beef it's a little trickier, and where it gets trickier is the integration with dairy, and I think we can't kind of forget about calf rearing, we can't forget about how we integrate those. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is my personal opinion, but my personal opinion is that we cannot meet our climate change targets without destocking. And so we are going to have to figure out how to take up to 10% of our beef cattle and dairy cattle off our land. And that's why I'm so fascinated by business models, because I think that for farmers, and this is what I'll be saying in Timaru tonight, for farmers, the way that we manage destocking is that we have to be playing at the premium end of the market. So in order for our farmers to do this, to take that 10% out, which I do believe can be done quite quickly, we will need to be sure that everybody else who's working with us in the marketplace is supporting us to get the highest possible price. And then the other piece of that is nose to tail. So at the moment, a lot of the non-primary cuts, and any of you here who eat meat, if you're not eating the whole animal, you're part of the problem. We sell lots of legs, but not that many livers, right? Not a lot of tongues. We need to be making sure that we are using the whole animal, and at the moment that's going to premium pet food, which is better than it used to just go to regular old pet food. But I think we also need a food revolution around how we premiumise grass-fed tongue, for example. So a long answer, but I think you can't put the two together. You can't put sheep and beef in the same category, and sheep, we really are there.
Can I just pick up on a number of interesting points there? The first one being, is actually sheep raising perfect? So, for example, there is still an awful lot of soil lost from hill farms. And in terms of emissions, methane is an absolute problem. And the IPCC makes it very clear that that has to be reduced. And methane doesn't fit under carbon neutrality. They're two separate gases. And so let's deal with the first one. Are you sure that the sheep system is actually that as perfect as you are saying it is?
I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think that it still is. I guess the claim that I have is that it's the best in the world, and I do believe that. I don't necessarily believe that for the way that we raise cattle in New Zealand, but I do believe that for sheep. And I accept that we have, there's still N and there's still, phosphorus, and we still have areas to work on, which we are working on, and as I say again, we've put out really clear water policies. We've been doing this for a very long time. We're not doing it in response to any government. We're in fact pushing the government to do it. And I think that's one area that farmers don't really get credit for. I think they're feeling under siege. But I see catchment committees around the country fighting for higher water standards than we have. So no, I don't think it's perfect. But I think there's a lot that's already been done.
But the ultimate challenge, though, for the food and farming system is to get to be as close as possible to zero emissions, and then to be truly restorative. I don't see that trajectory for the sheep industry, certainly not for dairy or beef. And the analogy I would draw is, I remember very vividly being in a presentation where BMW were laughing at the Toyota Prius, saying that clean diesel was the future of cars. And that was only about 6 years ago. And they then subsequently started making hybrid petrol cars, and now they're massively investing in electric cars. So I'm not sure that being the best of an old technology is necessarily the right place to be.
I agree with that, and I don't want you to hear that thinking that we're doing well means that we shouldn't do better. I absolutely believe that, and that's why I say I think we are committed to another 10% at least.
By when?
Well, we're still working through the dates with all of our members, but it will be within a moderately short period of time. And that 10%, we're looking for growth. We're not looking for offsetting, because I think that's the other thing that gets confusing for people. We are committed to absolute reduction of methane in the meat sector. Let me be clear about that. And one of the reasons is that, amongst other things, is that there's been a lot of debate around offsetting methane, and I agree with you there that it's not really, to me, that the science doesn't support that. It takes 10 years for methane to degrade to CO2. It's something we actually, we have to do gross numbers to take it down.
It's impossible to offset methane.
It is.
The really important issue, though, is not how short methane's in the atmosphere. It's about the damage that a molecule of methane does while it's there. And therefore, farming systems that produce methane have to accept some responsibility for that methane while it's there.
I think they do. I also would say, though, and this is not to diminish that, is that the science is quite different on biogenic methane than it is on industrial. And so what we now know is that at the height in the atmosphere that it's produced, and also the source of that methane is not methane. And I'm not saying this to reduce our responsibility. We are taking that on board as part of our responsibility. But I think we have to be very careful about lumping it all together and then saying, great, we'll have one solution for it. It's very different biogenic than it is coming from other sources.
They are, and sources, for example, from the oil fugitive gases from oil and gas sector, or from the waste stream, are completely different from farming. And the IPCC report out last week makes this incredibly clear, and really actually seeps home to the farming system. And that's why this idea that somehow the IPCC report lets us off in New Zealand because we are the BMW of farming is what
I didn't say that, and I hope that I didn't leave that impression, because what I guess I'm saying there is that we are absolutely committed to that reduction. And we should also remember that we've been doing this a long time, and because we've been doing it a long time, it's why we have faith that we can do it. as opposed to, I think there are quite a few commentators in New Zealand who are trying to let us off the hook. And I'm being clear, as beef and lamb, we are not being asked to be let off the hook. We have been doing it. That's why we know we can do it.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry we've gone over time.
A very big hand for Melissa, please. Thanks very much indeed. Yes, I will. Thanks. So, are you... See, you can...
Do you want to do it, given that